They keep wondering how you always seem to see the move before everyone else, don't they? They call it luck, because admitting you actually think differently would force them to question their own assumptions. You notice patterns people ignore. You listen when everyone else is busy talking. You don't rush into the first decision that feels good. You watch, calculate, adjust, and wait for the moment when action actually matters. And that's what makes intelligent people uncomfortable. You don't need to announce that you're thinking 3 steps ahead. You simply observe. While everyone else is trying to win the argument, you're studying the situation. While they're celebrating a small victory, you're already considering what happens next. But being a mastermind isn't about manipulating people or believing you're smarter than everyone on Earth. That's just ego wearing a fancy suit. Real intelligence is knowing what you don't know, staying curious, recognizing patterns, learning from mistakes, and changing your strategy when reality proves you wrong. You don't need to outsmart everyone. You need to understand yourself well enough that other people's pressure doesn't make your decisions for you. That's where your advantage begins. You become harder to distract because you know what matters. Harder to manipulate because you question assumptions. Harder to defeat because failure becomes information instead of an identity. And maybe that's why people keep underestimating you. Because you're not always interested in showing your hand. You're interested in understanding the game, the people, the timing, the consequences, and the move that makes sense when the noise finally disappears. While everyone else is trying to figure out how you keep winning, you're quietly becoming better at seeing what they never bothered to notice, the patterns behind the chaos, the opportunities hidden inside setbacks, and the power of thinking clearly when everyone else has already lost their head in the excitement, the fear, or the need to prove something immediately. You have to learn to see what everyone else is too distracted to notice. Because most people don't actually look at a situation. They look at what they expect to see, and that's where they become predictable. They walk into a room carrying assumptions, opinions, emotions, and little stories they've already written in their heads. Then they wonder why reality keeps surprising them. You don't have to make that mistake. Slow down. Watch. Listen. Notice the details people dismiss because they're too busy trying to be impressive. The person who talks the most isn't necessarily the person with the most influence. The loudest opinion isn't automatically the smartest one. The obvious opportunity isn't always the valuable one. Sometimes the important information is hiding in the silence, in the hesitation, in the tiny change in someone's behavior, in the pattern that keeps repeating when nobody bothers to connect the dots. That's where your mind becomes dangerous in the best possible way, not because you're manipulating people, but because you're paying attention while everyone else is performing. Imagine walking into a situation where everyone is arguing about what happened, and instead of joining the argument, you start asking why it happened. Suddenly you're playing a completely different game. You're not reacting to the noise, you're searching for the structure underneath it. What caused this? What changed? What keeps repeating? What information is missing? What assumption is everyone making without questioning? Those questions can completely change the way you move through life. You begin noticing that people often reveal themselves through consistency rather than speeches. Someone can promise anything, but their repeated behavior tells you much more. A business opportunity can look exciting, but the numbers reveal whether it's actually worth pursuing. A setback can feel like disaster, but sometimes it contains information about a weakness you needed to discover anyway. A rejection can feel personal, but sometimes it's simply redirection. You start seeing possibilities where other people see walls because you're no longer trapped inside the first interpretation of an event. And here's the strange part. Once you start noticing patterns, you can't easily unsee them. You begin recognizing when you're repeating your own mistakes. You notice which environments make you weaker and which ones sharpen you. You notice who brings clarity into your life and who constantly creates confusion. You notice how your own emotions influence your decisions, and that awareness gives you another level of control. Because intelligence isn't just collecting information. It's knowing which information matters. It's knowing when to speak and when silence gives you more data. It's knowing when to move and when waiting gives you an advantage. It's knowing when something deserves your attention and when it's just noise dressed up as urgency. You don't need to become suspicious of everyone or imagine secret meanings behind every ordinary event. That's not intelligence. That's letting imagination drive the car while reason sits in the trunk. Stay grounded. Verify what you can. Question assumptions, including your own. The smartest person in the room isn't necessarily the one who knows everything. It's often the one who can admit, I might be wrong, and then investigate instead of protecting their ego. That's how your thinking becomes sharper. You stop needing to be right immediately and start caring more about understanding what's actually true. And once you develop that habit, opportunities become easier to recognize because you're not waiting for them to announce themselves with flashing lights. You notice the opening before everyone starts running toward it. You recognize the lesson before the failure becomes expensive. You see the pattern before it becomes obvious, and you remain calm enough to decide what to do with what you've discovered. While everyone else is busy reacting to the surface, you keep looking underneath, searching for the detail that changes the entire picture. The small signal that tells you where the real opportunity is. The repeated behavior that reveals what words were trying to hide, and the overlooked possibility sitting quietly in the corner, waiting for someone patient enough to notice it. Because sometimes the biggest advantage isn't having a better weapon, a louder voice, or a bigger audience. It's simply seeing the game clearly before you decide whether you even want to play it. While the world keeps rewarding people who react quickly, you learn to become the person who observes carefully, thinks deeply, and moves deliberately, noticing what others overlook, and using that awareness to make decisions that look almost impossible to understand from the outside, even though the clues were sitting there the entire time for anyone willing to actually look. Think before you move, because the world is full of people who confuse speed with intelligence, and they rush toward every opportunity, every argument, every emotion, every shiny distraction, as if life is giving away trophies for reacting first. You don't have to play that game. Sometimes the smartest move is doing absolutely nothing for a moment. Let everyone else reveal what they're thinking while you collect information. Let the noise rise and fall. Let the excitement pass. Let the anger cool down. Because decisions made in the heat of emotion often look brilliant for 30 seconds and ridiculous the next morning. You don't need to be the fastest person in the room. You need to be the person who understands where the room is going. Before you act, ask yourself what you're actually trying to accomplish. What happens if you succeed? What happens if you fail? What information are you missing? What assumption are you making? What could you be overlooking because you desperately want a certain outcome? Those questions aren't weakness, they're armor. They keep your emotions from grabbing the steering wheel, while your reasoning sits in the passenger seat wondering what the hell just happened. And don't mistake hesitation for thoughtful decision making either. Thinking strategically doesn't mean endlessly analyzing every possibility until the opportunity disappears. There is a difference between preparation and procrastination. Gather enough information to make a reasonable decision, identify the major risks, choose your direction, and move. Then observe the results and adjust. That's how intelligent people operate in reality. They don't need perfect information, because perfect information usually arrives after the moment has already passed. They make the best decision available with the information they have, then remain flexible enough to change when new evidence appears. That's a powerful habit because it removes the ego from the process. You don't have to defend a bad decision just because you made it yesterday. If the facts change, your strategy can change too. Some people would rather lose than admit they were wrong because their pride has become more important than the outcome. Don't become that person. Your goal isn't to protect your ego. Your goal is to make better decisions, and sometimes that means walking away from something you desperately wanted because the numbers don't make sense anymore. Sometimes it means saying no to an opportunity everyone else is celebrating. Sometimes it means waiting while other people rush ahead and exhaust themselves. Sometimes it means taking the boring option because boring keeps you alive, profitable, stable, or focused. The world loves dramatic moves because dramatic moves make good stories. Real success is often built through quiet decisions nobody notices. You save instead of spending. You prepare instead of improvising. You listen instead of interrupting. You study instead of pretending you already know. You pause instead of reacting. You choose the long-term result over the temporary emotional reward. And slowly, those choices create an advantage that doesn't look impressive in the beginning, but becomes impossible to ignore later. That's the kind of thinking you want to develop. Don't ask, how can I look smart? Ask, what decision gives me the strongest position tomorrow? Don't ask, how can I win this argument? Ask, does this argument even matter? Don't ask, how can I prove them wrong? Ask, what action actually improves my life? Suddenly your priorities become clearer. You stop wasting energy on battles that produce nothing. You stop making decisions just because someone challenged your ego. You stop letting other people's urgency become your emergency. You start moving with intention instead of impulse. And that creates a strange kind of confidence, because you know that even when something goes wrong, you didn't simply react blindly. You considered the situation, accepted the risk, made the best move you could, and stayed ready to adapt when reality changed. While everyone else is busy making noise about what they're going to do, you quietly decide what actually needs to be done, when it should be done, and what you're willing to risk to make it happen. Because the real advantage isn't always knowing the perfect move before anyone else. It's having enough discipline to pause, enough courage to act, and enough humility to change direction. When the evidence tells you that your first move wasn't the right one, turning every decision into another opportunity to sharpen your judgment, strengthen your patience, and become much harder to control through pressure, emotion, urgency, or someone else's need to see you react immediately, while you remain focused on the outcome instead of the performance, thinking before you move, and letting your actions carry the weight that impulsive words never could. Failure has a funny way of introducing itself as a disaster when it's actually carrying information you desperately needed. Because the moment something goes wrong, most people don't ask what they can learn from it. They ask who to blame, what went wrong with everyone else, and how quickly they can pretend it never happened. But you don't have to waste a mistake like that. If you lose, study the loss. If you fail, examine the failure. If a plan collapses, don't just mourn the plan, dissect it. Find the weak point. Find the assumption that was wrong. Find the decision you made too quickly. Find the detail you ignored because you wanted the outcome badly enough to believe everything would work out. That's where the value is hiding. A mistake becomes expensive when you repeat it. The first failure can be tuition. The second failure can be a warning. The third identical failure starts looking like a personal subscription to the same problem. You don't need that subscription. Learn. Adjust. Move differently. And don't confuse learning from failure with constantly beating yourself up. That's not analysis. That's punishment. You don't become smarter by telling yourself you're stupid every time something goes wrong. You become smarter by examining the situation honestly without protecting your ego. Maybe you made the wrong choice? Fine. Admit it. Maybe someone gave you bad information. Learn how to verify it next time. Maybe you trusted the wrong person. Learn what signs you ignored. Maybe your strategy was good, but your timing was terrible. Learn patience. Maybe you worked hard but focused on the wrong thing. Learn priorities. Every failure contains clues if you're willing to look at them without flinching. And here's the part people don't like. Sometimes success comes from failures that nobody else ever sees. The business idea you didn't launch because you studied the numbers. The relationship you walked away from because you finally recognized the pattern. The investment you didn't make because you noticed the risk. The argument you didn't start because you knew where it would lead. Those are invisible victories, but they're still victories. Experience teaches you not only what to do, but what not to do. That's valuable knowledge. Over time, you develop what looks like intuition from the outside, but underneath it is accumulated evidence. You've seen enough patterns to recognize them faster. You've made enough mistakes to notice danger earlier. You've experienced enough disappointment to stop believing every promise. You've learned enough about yourself to know which situations bring out your worst decisions. That's how failure becomes information. It upgrades your internal map. But don't become so obsessed with avoiding failure that you stop taking intelligent risks. If you're terrified of every mistake, you'll eventually become terrified of movement itself. You need enough courage to try, enough discipline to prepare, and enough humility to learn when the result isn't what you expected. The goal isn't to create a life where nothing goes wrong. That's impossible. The goal is to become someone who can extract value from what goes wrong. That's a much stronger goal. When something fails, ask better questions. What did this teach me? What will I do differently next time? What part was within my control? What part wasn't? What warning signs did I miss? What new information do I have now that I didn't have before? Those questions turn disappointment into strategy. They stop you from remaining emotionally trapped inside the event. You stop saying, "This ruined me," and start saying, "This taught me something I won't have to learn the same way again." While everyone else is trying to hide their mistakes, you become willing to examine yours because you understand that embarrassment is temporary, but wisdom compounds. And every time you learn from a failure, instead of allowing it to define you, you become harder to surprise, harder to discourage, and much more capable of making the next decision with clearer information, stronger judgment, and less emotional baggage. Because the smartest people aren't the ones who never lose. They're the ones who refuse to lose the lesson, taking every setback apart piece by piece until the experience becomes knowledge. The knowledge becomes strategy, and the strategy becomes a better version of you, while the failure that once looked like proof that you weren't capable slowly becomes evidence that you were capable of adapting, capable of learning, capable of recovering, and capable of returning to the game with information that the person you were yesterday didn't have, carrying that information forward, instead of carrying the shame, the regret, or the need to pretend you never made the mistake in the first place. Because once you understand how to turn failure into information, even the moments that were supposed to break your confidence can become part of the machinery that builds it, quietly sharpening your judgment every time reality teaches you something your ego didn't want to hear. Stay impossible to manipulate, because the moment you understand your own values, priorities, weaknesses, and emotional triggers, other people lose a lot of power over you, and that's when things become interesting. Most manipulation doesn't arrive wearing a sign that says, "Hello, I'm here to control you." It usually arrives disguised as pressure, guilt, flattery, fear, urgency, or somebody suddenly acting like your decision is the most important thing in the universe. You need to decide right now. If you really cared, you'd do this. Everyone else agrees with me. Wonderful little tricks, and if you don't know yourself, they can work. The first defense is knowing what matters to you before somebody else tries to decide it for you. When your values are clear, you don't need to reinvent yourself every time somebody becomes disappointed. If honesty matters to you, You don't abandon it because lying would be easier. If your future matters to you, you don't destroy it for a temporary emotional reward. If peace matters to you, you don't enter every argument simply because someone challenged your ego. When you know your priorities, pressure becomes easier to recognize because you can ask one simple question. Does this actually serve what I'm trying to build? That question can save you from an incredible number of bad decisions. You also need to understand your emotional triggers. Maybe criticism makes you defensive. Maybe rejection makes you desperate to prove yourself. Maybe compliments make you trust people too quickly. Maybe anger makes you say things you regret. Maybe fear makes you rush. None of that makes you weak. It makes you human. But if you know where your buttons are, you become harder to push. Someone can press the button, but you don't have to let the machine start. That's the difference between having emotions and being controlled by them. You can feel anger without acting recklessly. You can feel fear without surrendering your judgment. You can feel excitement without making a foolish commitment. You can feel insulted without turning the insult into your entire mission. That's emotional discipline. And don't confuse being difficult to manipulate with becoming suspicious of everyone. Trust is important. Relationships matter. Cooperation matters. The goal isn't to assume everyone has a hidden agenda. The goal is to stop giving automatic access to your decisions. Listen to people. Consider advice. Then decide for yourself. A manipulative person often wants you to believe that independent thinking is disrespectful. It isn't. You can appreciate someone's opinion without surrendering your judgment. You can love someone without obeying them. You can respect someone without allowing them to control your boundaries. You can forgive someone without giving them unlimited access to your life. Those distinctions are powerful. And when somebody tries to rush you, slow down. When somebody tries to guilt you, examine the request. When somebody demands that you prove your loyalty by violating your own values, notice what they're actually asking you to sacrifice. When somebody constantly changes the rules so you can never satisfy them, stop playing the game. You don't need to win a game designed to keep you losing. Sometimes the strongest response is simply no. No explanation. No dramatic speech. No 17-minute presentation proving that your no is philosophically justified. Just no. Boundaries become stronger when they're followed by action. If someone repeatedly ignores your boundary, reduce their access. If someone repeatedly manipulates your emotions, create distance. If a situation becomes unsafe or seriously harmful, seek appropriate support rather than trying to handle everything alone. Intelligence isn't about proving you can survive every situation by yourself. Sometimes intelligence is knowing when another person, professional, or trusted resource can help. And the more comfortable you become with your own decisions, the less desperate you become for approval. That's where real independence begins. You stop changing your answer because someone frowned. You stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You stop chasing validation from people who benefit when you doubt yourself. You become calm enough to say, I understand your opinion, but I have made my decision, and then continue living. While people who once knew exactly how to provoke you suddenly discover that the old buttons don't work anymore. Because you've studied yourself more carefully than they've studied you. You've learned what you value, what you tolerate, what you refuse, what you're building, and what you're willing to walk away from, making manipulation much harder, because your decisions are no longer available to whoever speaks the loudest, creates the most urgency, or pushes the right emotional button. And that's a powerful kind of freedom, because you aren't trying to control everyone else. You're simply refusing to hand them control of your mind, your choices, your boundaries, or your future, while remaining open enough to listen, disciplined enough to question, and confident enough to change your position when genuine evidence proves you wrong. Because being impossible to manipulate doesn't mean believing you're always right. It means being strong enough to think for yourself. humble enough to examine yourself, and disciplined enough to choose your response, instead of allowing someone else's pressure to choose it for you, leaving other people's tactics with nowhere to land when your values are clear, your emotions are understood, and your decisions belong to you, not to their expectations, their approval, their anger, their guilt, or their need to control the outcome, while you continue building a life directed by principles rather than pressure, awareness rather than impulse, and deliberate choices rather than whatever emotion happens to be screaming the loudest in the room, making you far more difficult to manipulate, because the person making the final decision has finally become the person who understands you best, yourself. And every time you pause before reacting, question before believing, and choose before obeying, you strengthen that independence a little more, until your calm becomes something people cannot easily purchase with praise, control with fear, or break with disappointment, while you keep moving toward what actually matters without allowing somebody else's emotional storm to become the weather inside your own mind. Master yourself first. Because there's a beautiful little joke people keep missing. They spend their entire lives trying to control everything around them, while barely being able to control their own impulses, emotions, habits, and reactions. They want to control other people's opinions, control relationships, control outcomes, control the future, and then wonder why they feel exhausted all the time. But real intelligence begins somewhere much closer to home. It begins when you realize that the hardest person you'll ever have to manage is yourself, your anger, your fear, your ego, your impatience, your need for approval, your addiction to being right, your temptation to quit when nobody is watching. That's the real battlefield, not the person standing across from you. You can know every strategy in the world, but if one insult can make you lose your temper, you're still easy to control. You can have brilliant plans, but if distraction can steal your attention every 5 minutes, those plans are just expensive fantasies. You can understand people perfectly, but if you don't understand your own weaknesses, somebody eventually will. And that's where self-mastery becomes your greatest advantage. Start with your emotions. You don't have to destroy them. You have to understand them. Anger can tell you something matters, but it doesn't need to decide what you do next. Fear can warn you about danger, but it doesn't have to become your permanent address. Excitement can motivate you, but it shouldn't make every decision for you. Learn to pause between feeling and action. That tiny space is where freedom lives. Then look at your habits, because your future is often hiding inside the things you repeat when nobody is paying attention. What do you do every morning? What do you consume? Who do you listen to? Where does your time disappear? What promises do you make to yourself and then quietly break? You don't become powerful by making dramatic declarations about who you're going to become. You become powerful by keeping small promises to yourself until your own mind starts believing you. Wake up when you said you would. Finish what you started. Learn when you said you'd learn. Walk away when you said you would. Stop negotiating with the habits that keep dragging you backward. And don't expect perfection. That's another trap. You will fail sometimes. You'll lose focus. You'll make emotional decisions. You'll say something stupid. Congratulations, you're human. The difference is whether you learn from it or build a personality around it. Self-mastery isn't never falling apart. It's becoming better at putting yourself back together. It's recognizing the pattern faster. It's apologizing when you're wrong without collapsing into shame. It's changing your strategy without feeling like your identity has been attacked. It's knowing when your ego is talking and having enough discipline to tell it to sit down. Because ego loves drama. Ego wants to win every argument, prove every critic wrong, and make every mistake somebody else's fault. But your future doesn't care who won the argument yesterday. Your future cares what you do today. That's why mastering yourself is more valuable than mastering everyone else. When you can control your attention, you become harder to distract. When you can control your reactions, you become harder to provoke. When you can control your habits, you become harder to derail. When you can control your ego, you become easier to teach. When you can control your decisions, you stop living according to somebody else's expectations. And suddenly the person who once needed the world to cooperate before taking action realizes something much more useful. The world doesn't have to cooperate. You can still move. You can still learn. You can still adapt. You can still build. You can still walk away from what destroys your focus and walk toward what strengthens your future. While everyone else is busy trying to become powerful by controlling people, you become powerful by controlling the one thing you actually have authority over: your own choices, your own discipline, your own attention, and your own response to whatever reality throws at you. Turning self-awareness into strategy and discipline into freedom, until the version of you that used to react automatically begins disappearing, and something calmer, sharper, and more deliberate starts taking its place. A person who doesn't need to prove intelligence through arrogance, doesn't need approval before making decisions, doesn't need chaos to feel alive, and doesn't need everyone else to lose for you to win. Because the most dangerous person in any room isn't necessarily the loudest or the most aggressive. It's the person who understands their own mind well enough that fear can't easily steer them, anger can't easily hijack them, praise can't easily buy them, criticism can't easily break them, and pressure can't easily make them abandon what they know matters, while you continue mastering yourself one decision at a time, one reaction at a time, one habit at a time, one uncomfortable truth at a time, becoming the kind of person who no longer needs to control the entire world, because you've finally learned how to direct the person standing in the mirror. And once that happens, every other form of intelligence becomes far more useful, because strategy without discipline collapses, knowledge without action remains useless, confidence without humility becomes arrogance, and ambition without self-control becomes another cage you built for yourself, leaving you with the one advantage nobody can hand you and nobody can easily take away: the ability to choose who you become even when the world around you is trying to choose for you, while you keep sharpening your mind, strengthening your discipline, questioning your ego, and deciding deliberately what deserves your energy, what deserves your silence, what deserves your effort, and what deserves to be left behind, until your greatest victory is no longer defeating somebody else, but becoming someone who can walk through pressure, uncertainty, criticism, temptation, and chaos without surrendering control of the direction you're heading in. And that is where the real game becomes interesting, because once you master yourself, you stop needing the world to behave perfectly before you can become everything you were capable of becoming, while the noise continues around you, and you remain focused on the only territory you were ever truly responsible for: yourself.